All right, ladies and gentlemen, this will be the first screencast. The way I want you to approach these is I want you to think of the screencasts as basically a supplement to the reading. So I'm going to go through some things in the reading, not all of the reading. Okay, I'm going to bring in some outside stuff that isn't in the reading and talk about it. These should take about 10 or 15 minutes. I want you to fill in your fill in the blank notes to go along with this. And at the same time, feel free to pause, stop, go back, listen to it again. The nice thing about using the screencast is you can kind of work at your own pace. However, be aware this isn't really a replacement for the reading, it's more a supplement to the reading. So you need to make sure that you actually read the chapter to go along with this. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the author's textbook, Chapter 1. The author of your textbook, N. Gregory Mankiw, calls it the 10 Principles of Economics. And that's how he organizes basic economic principles. And we're going to talk about some of the key ideas, and then we'll talk later in class about in a little bit more detail. So economics is basically the study of the choices people make to satisfy their wants and needs. And the reason we have to make choices, and this is kind of a fundamental economic principle, is the idea that there is scarcity. Scarcity is the idea that there aren't enough resources to meet our wants and needs. We have limited resources, but we have unlimited wants. We want as much as we can get. There's never really going to be enough to go around. Now, you have to be really careful with the concept of scarcity. Scarcity is closely related to the idea of a shortage, but they're different. And the primary difference is scarcity is eternal. We're always going to want more than society can produce. Shortages, by contrast, are temporary. A shortage is when a popular toy gets sold out at Christmas time. A shortage is when there's a fad and everybody has to pick something up. Scarcity is this idea that we don't live in a utopia where everyone can have everything they want. The father of modern economics is this guy to the right known as Adam Smith. Adam Smith was the first major person to talk about economics, and he talked about it in his kind of seminal textbook, which is known as The Wealth of Nations. Now, The Wealth of Nations was published in 1776, kind of at about the same time as the American Revolution. And The Wealth of Nations talked about self-interest. Okay? The idea that individuals don't do things because they worry about society, but they worry about themselves. And we're going to talk a lot more in class about this concept of doing what's best for yourself. And what's interesting, what Smith found and what most other people have found since then, is if you do what's best for yourself, you actually can do what's best for society at the same time. Now, the author's first principle is people face trade-offs. A trade-off is the idea that in order to get something, I have to give something up. This is embodied by the notion of there's no such thing as a free lunch. It's a very common economic expression. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And what economists mean by that is even if I were to offer you a free lunch, you would have to give up your time to get it. There are some classic trade-offs that we talk about in economics. Guns or butter is one of the better known ones. That's the idea that if society focuses on producing goods, they can produce more military equipment, but that military equipment comes at the expense of civilian goods. If, on the other hand, a society focuses on just producing civilian goods, well, that means they're going to have less of a military. We could focus on efficiency or equity. Efficiency, if we were to think about economics as a pie, efficiency is the idea that we're going to worry about making the biggest pie we possibly can. And we don't even care who gets how much. On the other hand, if we were worried about equity, we're worried about how that pie gets divided. We want to make sure that we divide that pie equally. And what economists have found is when we try to promote efficiency, that has the unwanted effect of harming equity. At the same time, when we try to promote equity, that has the unwanted effect of harming efficiency. So you can't have both efficiency and equity. Now, principle 2. The cost of something is what you give up to get it. This is probably the most important principle. It's the idea of what economists call opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the next best thing you give up when you make a decision. Okay? The next best alternative you give up when you make a decision. Now, you're not in class right now, but think about it this way. You're listening to this podcast, okay? Or you're watching this screencast, I should say. Deciding to watch this screencast, or even me making this screencast, costs tangible things. I'm giving things up when I'm making this screencast. I could be doing other things. I could be playing with my children. I could be watching TV. I could be reading a book. I could be grading papers. There are a number of different things that I could be giving up, okay? But instead, I'm actually recording this video for you to watch. Another great example is if you think about the real cost of college. What's the actual cost of college? And what you'd be surprised, the true cost of college often isn't tuition. It's the idea that you can't work while you're there. So you're giving up income in order to study. Now, principle 3, rational people think at the margin. And what economists mean by the margin, when we talk about the margin in economics, what we're really talking about is the edge. Okay, I'll give you a good example of this in class. Okay, what we mean by marginal analysis. But the basic idea behind this is people will take action when the benefits are greater than the cost. Okay, so for example, if I'm working and, well, bad example, if I own a business and I decide to stay open an extra hour, I have to pay my workers $50 to stay open that extra hour. On the other hand, I'm going to bring in $100 in revenue. Well, that's a smart decision because I'm bringing in more revenue than I'm paying out in labor costs. However, if I have to pay my workers $100 to only bring in revenue, I'm not going to want to do that. Okay? So as a consumer, I want to maximize what's called my utility. Economists use the word utility for benefit. It's more than benefit, and we're going to talk a lot more about utility later in the class, but we really mean benefit. Producers, firms, business owners, whatever you will, want to maximize their profit. They want to get as much money for themselves as they possibly can. Oh. Now, principle 4. This one should seem pretty obvious. It's obvious to most people. People respond to incentives. Okay? An incentive is something that motivates you to act. It can be a reward or a punishment. Okay? Think of it like the carrot and stick approach. You see incentives all over the place. There are great examples of incentives all over the place. For example, in a kindergarten classroom, you might see a stoplight with kids' pictures, and it's got a green light, a red light, and a yellow light. When the kids behave, their picture goes to the green light. They get a reward after they behave so many times. If they get in trouble, maybe they go on yellow. And if they really have a bad day, they go on red and they don't get a sticker. There's a call home, they miss recess, something like that. Okay? There are all kinds of hidden incentives we have to be careful about. Okay? Oftentimes when you create a system, the incentives don't work the way you want. And we're going to talk about a couple of great examples of hidden incentives in class. Now, principle 5. Trade can make everyone better off. Trade is in a zero-sum game. In a zero-sum game, one person wins, one person loses. Trade is not a zero-sum game. Trade can actually benefit everyone. In the next, in chapter 3, we're going to learn how trade actually benefits everyone. But trade allows for specialization. People can spend their time in countries and societies, can spend their time what they do best. Instead of worrying about trying to do everything, you get to specialize and do the things that you do well. Principle 6, generally speaking, markets are the best way to organize economic activity. Okay? A market economy is an economy that allocates resources through millions of different decisions happening at any given time. You have countless firms and individuals acting for their own best interest. And what's interesting about market economies, and it's a big chunk of what we're going to learn in this class, is market economies are very functional. They're actually often much more functional than what are called centrally planned economies. Now, market prices, generally speaking, reflect the value to consumers. And centrally planned economies often fail because they don't allow the market to function. Okay, centrally planned economies fail because markets don't, because there are no markets and individuals and businesses have no incentive, and we'll talk about this a little more in class as well, to actually achieve.
So markets are usually the most effective way to organize economic activity. And generally speaking, most economists, not all economists, but most economists favor more of a free market, or what's kind of been known as laissez-faire. Kind of means let it be, let the market work itself out. We should have little government intervention, but governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. Most economists would argue that there is some need for government intervention in the economy. One of the most basic ways the government can intervene in the economy is trying to enforce what's called property rights. So, property rights are the idea that if you create property, okay, whether it be real estate, any private property for that matter, you should have the ability to own and exercise control over it. Okay, it's not up to other people how you're going to dispose of your property. It's really up to the individual. And you need a government to enforce property rights. Okay, and you especially need to make sure that the government respects property rights and isn't confiscating property from private citizens. We also might see some government interference, or government intervention, I should say, in the economy in an effort to promote either efficiency or equity. If we want to make the economy run more efficiently, or if we want to see a more equitable outcome from the economy. One kind of classic example where you might want to see a government improve efficiency is through what's called an externality. So an externality is when one person's actions impact the people around them. Kind of the classic economic externality is smoking. So when you have smoking, the smoker pays the price of smoking. They pay for the cigarettes, they pay for the related health costs, they pay for the related social stigma. All of the prices, all of the cost that goes with smoking is, well, much of the cost that goes with smoking is paid by the cigarette smoker themselves. However, there is an extra or an external cost that is paid by the bystanders in the form of more expensive health insurance premiums, in the form of damage to the environment through secondhand smoke. So what happens when there is an externality is you will often see the government intervene and create some kind of regulation, rule that business or individuals have to follow, okay, in order to make the economy run more efficiently for everyone. Now, externalities we're going to get a lot more into much later in the course, but externalities aren't always negative. Everyone automatically assumes an externality is negative. That's actually not always the case. Externalities can also be positive, where the benefits of the action are being passed on to bystanders. For example, if I were to landscape the front of my house and spend a lot of money making the front of my house look nicer, I would receive some benefits, my house would look nicer, but my neighbors would also receive some benefits. Now, the first 7 principles are really what we're going to focus on in our course. The first 7 principles that the author of your textbook talks about is really the microeconomic principles. The next 3 principles, principles 8, 9, and 10, are really more macroeconomic. So I'm going to go through these kind of quickly. We're not going to spend a ton of time on these because they're really not the focus of the class. So 8 through 10 are macro principles, kind of looking at the economy on the large scale. 1 through 7 are microeconomic principles. They're looking at the economy on the small scale. So principle number 8 is a country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce its goods and services. This is the idea that a country does not create wealth simply by hoarding currency, by stockpiling gold and silver, if you will. Wealth really comes from productivity, right? The ability of a country's citizens to make goods and services. A great example of this is in 1500, 1600, the wealthiest country in the world was Spain. And the reason Spain was so exceptionally wealthy is they had hoarded gold that they had taken from the New World. And if you travel through Spain today, you would still see gold-covered altars, inlaid gold in churches, tons and tons of gold. By 1800, England was the wealthiest country in the world. England has no natural gold supply. England did not conquer areas that were really rich in gold. What England did have, however, was productivity, the ability to produce goods and services. And as productivity rises, so does standards of living. The more productive you are, the greater the standard of living for the entire country. Now, Principle 9. Prices rise when governments print too much money. This is known as inflation. Inflation is the gradual rise, usually gradual rise in prices over time. Inflation is caused when you have the same number of dollars chasing an increasing number of dollars chasing the same number of goods. So you have more and more dollars, but productivity isn't increasing. So sometimes when governments find themselves in fiscal difficulty, one of the solutions that they might choose to engage is to actually just run the printing presses, print more money. Unfortunately, this is rarely a solution, especially in the long run, because what happens is the more money you print, the less valuable your currency is. However, the one thing we have to take note of, some inflation is good for the economy. You don't want to have deflation. Deflation is when prices fall over time. The reason you don't want to have deflation is when prices are falling, consumers are reluctant to actually spend. So consumers see prices falling, they wait to get a better deal on products and services. This will cause prices to fall even further, which will cause consumers to wait even longer to get goods and services. And this is what's called a deflationary spiral. So you want to have a little bit of inflation. Generally speaking, the target for developed countries is about 2% per year. Any more than 2% per year, and you risk too much price volatility. Any less than 2% per year, and you risk actually slowing economic growth. Now, Principle 10. Societies face a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So one role of government is to smooth the business cycle. The business cycle is the period of macroeconomic expansion followed by macroeconomic contraction. Boom and bust cycle, expansions and depressions and recessions. Okay? So in order to combat the business cycle or to smooth out the business cycle, during a depression, what the government will often do is actually try to get more money into circulation, put more money into people's pockets. This has the unwanted impact of causing inflation. During a boom time, what the government often wants to do, when inflation is high, what the government often wants to do is actually take money out of circulation. They can do this in a number of ways. Probably the biggest way that they do it is by raising interest rates. And we'll talk a little bit about this in class. Unfortunately, what we've found is when the government tries to take money out of circulation, it has the unwanted effect of causing unemployment. So there's a trade-off, right? A trade-off is when you give something up to get something else. When you try to promote full employment, you end up with inflation. When you try to control inflation, you end up with unemployment. And central banks and governments have to balance these two competing goals: inflation and unemployment. We will talk about this 10 principles translated in class. Please make sure that you're also reading the chapter. I know I said this before. It's very, very important that you read the chapter to go along with this lecture. There's a lot more details in there. And also make sure that you're filling in your fill-in-the-blank notes. Have a great day.